around to help you. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker. Is there anyone in this audience who's seen the film Summerhill? Remember, there was that austere woman who would come and who would check and tell everyone that everything was not working right. That evil person is in front of you now. That is not technically true because by that time Derry had already taken up his post at Summerhill. But he was the person who was testing, who was checking, who was evaluating people's work, whose job it was to decide whether Summerhill would continue. He is the person who used to work at Summerhill, who was around helping create democratic education as a movement. This is a person who is still very genuinely and intimately interested in the destinies of his former graduates. And he told us a story yesterday about a graduate who is now 60. Somebody who finished a democratic school is now aged 60. When we'd only just started this stream, planning for this stream, it was really crucial for me and my colleagues to align our speakers time-wise so that they eventually prove beyond a reasonable doubt that democratic education was really a very worthy thing, something that we should all engage in. Is anyone still left in doubt that it bears no peril, that it's not dangerous, that it's... Is there anyone who needs more convincing, more persuasion? Okay. On this note, I hand over to our next speaker who will dispel any doubts.
I'm sure it's not true. I'm really sorry to cut Henry short. I'm sure you'd like to hear more about Summerhill. I was wondering about changing the title of my talk. I was going to call it Another Way is Possible, but maybe I should call it Sneaking a Slice of Summerhill into a State Secondary School. That's very good alliteration. I don't know the word for alliteration in Ukrainian. Anyway, I should have a present. But how do I change it? How do I change what's here? Do you have a clicker? Anyway, this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what is wrong with most of our schools and our school systems, and then what democratic education can contribute to improving things so that we can face the challenges of the future, climate change and the fourth industrial revolution. I will refer to my own experience as a teacher and an inspector in England. I apologize for being tired, old, with grey hair, and worst of all, a man. So I can't do anything about it, so now's your chance to escape for a cup of coffee. Who's going? Nobody going. Okay, woo! So what's wrong with what we have now? No, I can't change the screen. Oh, I can change the screen. What do I do? Hey, how about that? Fantastic, thank you. I think that the English philosopher Bertrand Russell and the American philosopher John Dewey were both correct when they said that conventional authoritarian schools offer the choice of becoming either submissive or rebellious, and that neither provides a good preparation for living in a democracy or taking responsibility for your own life. The same idea is expressed in the Ukrainian 2016 policy document from your own Ministry of Education, entitled The New Ukraine School. Does it work? Yes. I really like this. It lists the qualities required by young people today and tomorrow, all of which I agree with. Creativity, critical thinking, goal setting, teamwork, communication, and it powerfully describes the failure of your existing school system to develop these skills. Your document says at present most schools just stuff kids' heads with more and more out-of-date information and then test their memorization of it, thereby generating maximum anxiety, mental ill health, damage to well-being, none of which is conducive to deep and meaningful learning. The Ukrainian document creates an unforgettable metaphor in describing the typical Ukrainian school student as being like a stuffed fish. It looks like a fish, but it can't swim. I guess that we're here today because we agree with this point of view, to some extent anyway. To reinforce the point, I will repeat a few words from a brilliant piece of writing that won this year's Scottish School Students' Young Writer of the Year award. She writes, and incidentally, she speaks for millions of British kids, probably also for millions of Ukrainian kids, who are trapped in our anxiety-ridden, testing-obsessed, PISA performance-driven day prisons that we call schools. She writes, "We are told that if we are not fit to work, then we are worthless. There is no love in learning anymore. We envy the people who have left school already. Whatever happened to expanding your horizons? Assignments where you can research what you want count for nothing. Finding out who you are and what you care about is not important." She says, "I have been flattened by a concrete curriculum so structured and unforgiving that I've forgotten how to function without it. With no bell ringing at intervals, no grading to build our lives around, how will we cope? They say that high school is the best years of your life, but not in this world, where qualifications matter more than personal qualities. I feel that I have grown backwards," she says, "as if I know less about myself and who or what I could be than when I started. The curriculum must release its chokehold on the throats of the nation's children and let them breathe. But for us," she says, "it's too late. For now, we just have to wait until the final bell rings and we walk out of the school door forever." What a terrible thing to say, but I'm pleased that she won this main Scottish award for young writers with this piece. So obviously somebody took it seriously. 20 years ago at a Council of Europe conference on how to teach democracy and human rights, I said that learning about democracy and human rights when I was at school was like reading holiday brochures in prison. You can't learn to swim if you're not allowed in the water. Did it come? Democracy and respect for human rights require skills as well as understanding. They have to be practiced in the everyday life of the school and not just talked about by teachers or written about in examinations. In my experience, young people need time and space to discover themselves, to find their interests and passions, to learn from each other, to create their own identities. In our schools now, we don't allow this, and we even pursue our students into their homes with homework. This is why Yakov and I are arguing for our 1 day per week, the 20% rule. 1 day a week in all schools now should be given to the students to negotiate with the teachers. It still leaves the state 80%, for God's sake. Isn't that enough? We should have 20% today. We both were able to make this argument at a big meeting of 2,000 people in Strasbourg a couple of years ago, and everybody agreed with us. So I think it is a realistic thing to ask. 20% for the kids now. The other way that I found both necessary and possible as a teacher could be described as democratic education. So what do I mean by democratic education? I don't have time to say all this. You can read it if you understand the English, and if you'd like a copy of this presentation, you're very welcome to it afterwards. But I mean two things. The first I call SPDM, student participation in decision-making, choosing what and how they will learn, etc. The second I call SPDDM, student participation in democratic decision-making, about how to manage the class and the school democratically with respect for human rights, because democracy on its own can become quite poisonous. It has to go together with human rights. So these schools of learning and decision-making should not be too large, maybe 150, 200. I think it's important that everybody can know everybody else in the school meeting. My school, when I was a principal, had 1,000 kids, so we broke it up into learning communities of 150. I think that was about right. And then you need to break it up again into groups of maybe 15, 20, 25, so that everybody can speak in the meeting. Now, both SPDM and SPDM, both are needed for young people to discover their own purposes, to create their own identity. This is already important, but it will become much more important as the fourth industrial revolution unfolds. If you don't know what it is, go and look it up. But basically, artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning threaten the capacity of work, or rather full-time paid employment, to provide security of identity for most of us, as this paid employment is rapidly ceasing to exist. Only a few % of people will be required to know how to create and develop this high-tech world that is advancing like a tsunami. The rest of us, supported by some sort of universal basic income, which incidentally has been trialled with great success in Canada and Finland, some sort of universal basic income will be needed to support our lack of paid employment, but this will also give us time. And to make good use of this time, we need to know who we are. It could provide us with the time to enrich our lives and the quality of our democracies. But schooling as we know it does not help young people prepare for this. We need another kind of school, where young people can discover and develop in freedom their own talents, purposes, passions, and at the same time learn how to manage democratic societies which respect diversity, as Yakov said, the core to human rights. Now, we know coercive education doesn't do this. It can't do it. You can't force people to develop these skills. You have to give them freedom and time and space. Now, some small private democratic schools, like Summerhill or Sudbury Valley or Hadera, provide us with models. I call these schools pioneers of possibility. These fully democratic schools share certain features. No two are quite the same. Are you all reading? No, I know you can't possibly do it, but you can have a copy of this afterwards if you would like. Democratic assessment. It's really important that we stop testing kids every 10 minutes just because big private companies make a lot of money out of testing. Yakov says I'm obsessed with this, and he's right. It makes me very angry. So this, when they work, can create questioning, critical thinking, people able to participate in decision-making, can show leadership, but also when to follow, and concern for the community but also to do things for themselves. Thank goodness we have some of these schools, and of course we need more of them. Those of us who are working in mainstream schools, as I have done, in our state schools, we have to be a little more like the fox, a little cunning and opportunist. Maybe I said that. Oh no, that's to come. I like the new Ukraine school document. It refers to schools needing to become places that no longer reproduce the poverty ladder. How important. There's only one country in the world where the success of children in school does not depend on the income of their parents. There's only one country. It's Finland. And they've learned to do this over the years, to detach parents' money from kids' success. But we all need to aim for this, and I was so pleased to see it in the Ukraine document. Instead, the new Ukraine school says we have to lever social equity, consolidate communities of creative enterprising. This is all great, but there's no mention of democracy in the new Ukraine school document, or human rights. And I'm puzzled that these things are missing. Perhaps we could talk about it later, why this is with some of you. Anyway, the task of creating necessary change in our state schools is not easy. It's a struggle to change the stuffed fish schools. It will cause anxiety for teachers, for parents, and for students. How we do it will depend on how we can adapt the two principles of curriculum choice and democratic communities to the realities that we find ourselves in. I think it's always possible to do something, but you can't do it all immediately. You have to be a little bit cunning. I really like the fox as an animal. When I was a farmer, I hated the fox because they always found a way to kill my chickens. But if you think about how the fox lives, they're very, very opportunistic. They always look for their chance. We have to be the same. So some school students are already demanding change to the curriculum. OBESU, the European School Students Organization, has been doing this for years. They've been waiting for a uniting issue, an overwhelming imperative that all young people can unite around. And it looks as if climate change is becoming this issue. I'm very excited by the Greta Thunberg phenomenon, where demand for school change is being driven by the students themselves. You have this courageous 16-year-old from Sweden whose school strike movement has now spread to 36 countries. I don't know about Ukraine. I haven't heard about any school strikes for climate change here, but if it hasn't started, it should. I joined 1,500 young people in my hometown of Brighton a few weeks ago. They were on strike from school for climate change. Many of the young strikers that I spoke to knew more about climate change than their teachers. They knew more about it than their parents, and they certainly knew more about it than the politicians. In England, 200 academics have come out to support the students with their school strikes. In Germany, I was very pleased that the official education authorities said to the children, you can't go on strike. But Angela Merkel supported the young people. This was great. And so did Leo Varadkar, the Prime Minister of Ireland, which is half my country. I was very pleased about that too. In the UK, the government said the school students should stay in school and learn mathematics, and the parents were right, the head teachers were right to punish the kids. But in hundreds of schools, the kids walked out anyway. The first time in my town, 800, the second time, 1,500, and the third time, 3,000. School change is also being driven by parents. For example, we just have the first Sudbury school in England, and I'm on the board. I'm very proud of that. Yes, thank you very much. There are 35 new schools in France and maybe 1,000 democratic schools around the world. So my own story is one of a fox, an opportunist, learning to communicate and learning to find friends to create change at the level of the teacher, the first as a class teacher, and eventually as a school principal. Why did I bother to look for another way? Well, there's so many ways. There's so many reasons why we need change. I can't possibly go through them all. Yes, yes, yes. But here was one of the biggest reasons for doing it. I thought kids would learn more in a democratic school, and it's absolutely true they do. When they become motivated, you can't stop them learning. But maybe one of the most important reasons was this. I loved working in this way with young people because it's fun. And you know what? When you're having fun, you're not anxious and you learn an awful lot. So maybe actually this was my main reason. But you can have all these other reasons as well if you want them. We have to improve learning, to open minds, help kids think for themselves, to develop curiosity and collaboration, to respect diversity, as Jakob said, to see through the violent snake oil of populist demagogues. By God, we have them in England. We've got them in the United States. They're spreading around the world like a disease, who encourage us to look for people to blame for our social and economic problems. My ideas were grounded in a long tradition of progressive child-centred education in England, though this is normally ignored in our teacher education. It's encouraging to find these ideas in the new Ukraine school. The idea that curriculum and learning should be a partnership between pupils, teachers and parents, that teachers and pupils should become friends who can relate together without fear. And of course that means reducing coercion. Straight from the A.S. Neil Summerhill songbook, you could say. In my first post as a young teacher, I was able to bring about change in one class. I trained as a primary school teacher because I liked the idea of being able to create an integrated curriculum which would take into account the interests of the children. But I couldn't find a school with a job. I found a secondary modern school with a progressive head teacher. Secondary modern schools in England exist for children who are not intelligent enough to go to university. They go to the gymnasium, the grammar school. For those who fail the test at 11, they go to the secondary modern. It's rubbish, of course. You can't predict, but that's what we did, and it's what we still do in large parts of England. I had a class of 36 kids who'd failed the test, and I had a head teacher who wanted me to teach a lot of subjects, not just one. I really like this. Of course, for the middle-class parents in my class, it was a catastrophe. So I taught all these kids history, geography, English, social studies, and religious knowledge. On my first day as a teacher, I arranged the chairs in a circle. All the subjects had given me stuff I was supposed to teach, but I chucked it in the bin with the tacit approval of the head teacher. He said, "You must develop an integrated curriculum." What he didn't expect was for me to do this with the children making the decisions. So we sat in the circle, I said who I was, I explained that history was about the past, geography was about different places, and the people who lived there, religious knowledge was what people believed, social studies was how people lived together, and English was about communication. And I explained that anybody could ask questions to discuss what I'd said, but please only speak when you're holding the special book. One boy immediately took the book and he said, "I think that covers everything in the world. Can we study anything in the world?" So I said, "You got it. I suppose it does. You can study what you choose. Only one condition, that when you've studied it, you tell the rest of us what you had learned." And so it began. Individuals and groups worked on projects on a wide range of subjects. Soon, it was only one room. We had to elect a chairperson. We decided to have a meeting every week to organize ourselves. By majority vote, we decided to have a meeting at the start of every day. Then we had to elect a class secretary to write down our decisions. Gradually, more and more jobs were created, and during the 2 years we were together, everybody did more than one job. Projects could last as long as they wanted to, but the rule was when you finished a project, you had to talk to the rest of the class about what you'd done. Then we created a class newspaper. It started on one wall of the room. It soon spread to all the rooms, the door, the blackboard, even things went onto the ceiling of the room, and lots of different kids edited different parts of the newspaper. I said I wanted to be the class teacher, helping everyone with their learning. I could, I said, be the class policeman if I have to be, but I don't really want to be. But it was soon obvious that to manage such a hive of activity, some rules would be needed. These were discussed and we voted on them at the Friday meeting. And I used these discussions to introduce ideas like the rule of law, democracy, one person, one vote, minority rights. Well, if you let kids make the laws, they soon make lots of them. I agreed with some. I thought others were silly, but never mind. They usually turned out to be sensible in the end. I said you can make any laws you like, as long as they don't break the school rules or the laws of England. Of course, then you have a problem. If you make laws, you have to decide what to do when they're broken. So this led to the creation of a class court with elected magistrates and a jury. Some of the laws I would never have thought of in a million years. They invented what they called the 5 minutes quiet rule. If the room became too noisy, 5 people put their hands up, then we had 5 minutes quiet. Then, of course, we had to have a timekeeper to decide when the 5 minutes was up. Kids started to whisper in quiet times, and I thought, this doesn't matter, because it's nice and quiet, we can all get on with our work. But kids don't think like that. They said, if it's quiet, no whispering. And they were very severe about whisperers. That was really funny. It was a good example of where their idea of how to make the rule work was quite different to mine. Anyway, the legal system worked brilliantly for the 2 years. I was afraid that when the head teacher found out what I was doing, I'd be fired. On the contrary, because parents started to say to the head teacher, what's going on in that class? Our kids are looking forward to going to school. They're working on projects all day and all night. They've become confident again after failing the examination. And head teachers love good news from parents. So instead of being fired, I got put in charge of all the 7 classes in this year group. This was 220 kids and 7 teachers. The head decided I must check that these kids in Derry Hannam's class are learning something, not just having a lot of fun. So he gave a verbal reasoning test to all the 7 classes. I was a bit embarrassed when my class got the highest mark by quite a long way. And then, of course, I started to have some trouble with other teachers, especially when kids in other classes said, why can't we have a class meeting? Why can't we have a class court? And then I had some parents saying, please can my kid be put into Derry Hannam's class? This did not improve my relations with the other teachers, but you have to learn to think about these things when you do it, but it's very difficult to predict. You're so busy doing it, you don't think about the effect it would have on other people, and I think you really have to remember to do this. Anyway, the second year I was put in charge of all 7 classes, and I was able to choose my team of teachers, and it really was wonderful what happened. I'm trying to skip bits because I realise I'm going on too long. Anyway, after the first year I wasn't fired, and we introduced the democratic approach. We had a committee for all the 220 kids, and we could sometimes meet together, and they planned all sorts of things, parties, football matches, discos, fashion shows, an amazing number of projects developed. Here's a funny thing. I've been asked to write a book about these 2 years. I was working on the book when on my computer screen came a bald-headed man who I didn't recognize. And he said, "Hey, Derry, you won't remember me. I was in your class 47 years ago. And guess what? You said to my parents, because I was very interested in transport systems, he used to draw plans of railway lines and railway stations for days on end. I said to his parents, I think one day Andrew will get a geography degree. And they said, no, nobody from this school goes to university. And he said, do you know what? I did get a geography degree, and now I'm the head teacher of a primary school, and I'm working in a democratic way, and I'm teaching the other primary school head teachers in my town how to run their schools in a more democratic way. So I thought, wow, this is 49 years. 49 years later, he's still doing it. And he was in touch with 6 or 7 people who were in that class all those years ago. And we met, and they all said, they've written a little bit in the book about this 2 years when they were 11 to 13 years old, laid down a kind of foundation for their whole lives. You never know what the outcomes will be, but it is worth a try. Oh, so many other stories I could tell you about this class. The day the head teacher brought some visitors to the class, and I was breaking the school rule, I wasn't in the classroom. You were supposed to be in your classroom all the time to supervise your class. And I never was. I was in the library with kids or in the town looking at something. The kids would be working in our room. He said to me, Derry, you've done it again. I said, it's okay. The kids supervise themselves. They are being supervised, but not by me. Anyway, one day he came into the class with some visiting teachers. And I wasn't in the classroom, but it was very quiet, and all the kids were getting on with their projects. And the visiting teachers were rather puzzled. And so they said, where's the teacher? Everybody seems to be getting on with their work. And so the head teacher said he knew that this boy Andrew was the class chairman. He said, Andrew, can you explain? And here's what Andrew said. He said, well, you see, our teacher, Mr. Hannam, is a bit of a softy. He's a bit soft. So if we didn't have our own class government, it would be chaos in here. And I love this story. He was very embarrassed, but for me, it showed it was working. Another time, we had the national press come to the class. I forgot to tell the head teacher. Oh dear, that's another story. And the kids used to go to the local teachers' college and give lectures on democracy. Once we had a child, a very unhappy child, from an ethnic minority. I won't say which one because I don't know what the situation is in Ukraine. But for example, in Hungary, there's a big problem with Roma children. Anyway, we had a child from an ethnic minority in my class. She was very, very unhappy. She'd never had any success in school, and she was about to be thrown out of the school for stealing. And one day after school, the kids were walking to my classroom, and they said, we're going to have a meeting to decide what to do about Paula. You can come if you want to. I thought, this is great. I'm the teacher. I can come if I want to. But anyway, I went to the meeting, and they talked about what to do. And they tried all sorts of ideas. Should they punish her one day and be nice to her another day? That was the idea of a slightly Asperger's-y boy. But the class decided what they would do. They would make her one of the class judges. So she would learn what it was like to have to deal with kids who broke the rules. They then decided to elect her to be the class chairman. All this was without her knowledge after the school had finished. The next day, she came to school, she came into the class, and they said, we're going to have a special class meeting. And they said, I'm afraid, Paula, you don't know this, but you are now the class chairperson, and you're also one of the class judges. She burst into tears and ran out of the classroom. Some of the kids went after her and brought her back. And she said, Nobody's ever been kind to me in school before. She was a wonderful judge and a wonderful chairperson. Unfortunately, her family moved on, and she didn't stay at the school for so long. Anyway, enough of that. Next, I just want to say a little bit about a community school. I ended up as a head teacher of a school. We turned it into a community school, where the school and the community became turned on to each other through democratic structures growing from the school. It began as a bet between me and some 17-year-olds. It was a country school and sheep farming and stone quarries. These students found the school rather boring. Have I run out of time? Ira, wake up. Have I got any time? Have I finished, or have I got some more time? How long have I got? 10 minutes, wow. Quick, get out while you can. I'm going to talk for another 10 minutes. Anyway, the kids decided there were only 20 clubs in this town. It was very boring. And I said, I'm sure there's more than that. I bet there's 40. So they went out and they did a study. They found 100 clubs in the town and in the country around the town. So what we did, we invited all the clubs and societies to come into the school, and we had a great community day. And lots of the clubs and societies decided they would let children join. And the school said, well, we've got a library, we've got all sorts of facilities, maybe your clubs and societies would benefit from. And we started having adults come into the school classes. It was wonderful. The town library closed, and all the books came into the school library. So when anyone in the town wanted to borrow a book, they had to come into the school. And the kids saw adults borrowing books. And it was a wonderful example. And this project of community education was completely managed by young people in the school. We developed a community orchestra with 100 players. The youngest was 6 years old, and the oldest was 85-year-old violin player. We had a community newspaper that was edited by young people and by older people. These organizations still exist in this school 40 years later, and it's the only school still that has no school uniform. We abolished the school uniform in 1980. The parents and the kids met together, decided no more school uniform. Grown-ups don't have to wear uniform. Why should kids have to wear uniform? And I'm proud to say that this school is now the only school in the Midlands of England that has no school uniform. And we went on to found the Community Education Association, because I think it's so important we break down the barriers. As Yakov said, between young people and older people. The school should just become a learning centre for everybody. Anyway, after this, I became a school inspector. It wasn't my best career move because I didn't like a lot of what I saw, but I was able to encourage creative practice where I found it. But the best thing was when the inspectors tried to close Summerhill, Zoe's mum phoned me up and said, Derry, can you work for us against the inspectors? And I wasn't quite sure, but that's what we did. I worked for the lawyers against the inspection system, and you probably saw the film or know the story. We won. It's the only time a school has won a court case against the inspectors in England. So I'm very proud of that. It was my best work as an inspector. I didn't become best friends with the chief inspector, but who cares? I became best friends with Zoe Redhead, and that's much more important. I'll conclude by mentioning a couple of other examples where opportunism comes in. I think it's very important. People often say to me, oh, this all sounds good, but do you have any evidence that it works? And I would just like to finish by, whoops, I can't make this thing work, by saying a bit about evidence. Dee-dee-dum, dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. I'll sing it as a blues. Democratic assessment, we gotta have more of it. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going backwards. Oh, I thought there was something wrong. I talked all about that. Carpets and Christian names. You've got to have carpets on the floor. When I first became head teacher of a school, it was quite a poor school, and just down the road there was a very prestigious school, and every day 2 buses full of kids would go from my town over the hill to the prestige school. And by the time we finished, there were still 2 buses, but they were coming the other way. They were coming from the prestige school to our school. That's a good sign. So does it work? Well, I just want to say a bit about this. Later on, I became advisor to our Minister of Education when he wanted to introduce citizenship education. And I said, if you want kids to learn, 5 minutes left, wonderful, thank you, I'm going to make it. I didn't know she was here doing this. No more, please. Or you cause panic. Anyway, I said, if you want kids to learn about democracy, they have to do it, not just listen to teachers talk about it and pass examinations. And he said, okay. And into the law for English schools came all kids from 14 to 16 should have the opportunity to participate in democratic decision-making, and better still, to actually implement the results of the decision-making, to actually do something about it. But the chief inspector heard about this, and he wrote articles in the national newspaper saying, this is just going to waste kids' time. It's going to diminish standards. It's going to damage learning. They should be learning more mathematics, not taking part in decisions. So the minister panicked. He's a nice guy. He was blind, David Blunkett. He said, have you got any proof that this works? So he gave me 25,000 quid and 2 days to go and do some research. I'm exaggerating, but I didn't have very long. So what I did, I found 20 secondary schools that were much more democratic, much more participative than most schools. And we compared the examination results, the attendance figures, and the exclusion figures for antisocial behaviour in different kinds of socioeconomic environments. We compared the more democratic schools with the average for all the other secondary schools in the country, 3,500 of them. And in every case, the more democratic schools got better exam results. More kids came to school every day, the attendance figures were better, and the number of people being excluded for antisocial behaviour was almost 0. This meant that the minister could say to the chief inspector, I have some evidence that you're wrong. Where is your evidence? Of course he hadn't got any. It was pure prejudice. So we managed to get this into the law in England for 10 years until we got a new Conservative government who, of course, abolished it. Another example is, am I down to 1 minute yet? Another example. In a poor city in the south of England, we created student councils in every school, and then a council for all the schools in the whole city. This was 15 years ago. Today, that's grown into a not-for-profit business, training not just schools, but companies into how to be more democratic in the whole of the south of England. And now one of my colleagues is in Rwanda, working for this organisation, which now employs 10 people. So school democracy can lead to successful entrepreneurial activity. One last example. We got the law changed for including kids on school boards. It had been illegal in England until 2002. And then we did some research to see what effect did having kids elected onto school boards make for the decision making. Again, overwhelmingly, the chairs of the school board said, once we got kids on the school board, we started making better decisions, and we can't believe there was ever a time when we didn't have them on the school board. The trouble is, this is still a minority of school boards. Okay, well, fortunately, there are projects going on in a number of countries, including here in Kiev, where the Council of Europe Vergeland Center is running a project in 50 schools in the Kiev area along these lines. I would love to talk to you about it. Perhaps the most important thing I've learned is the importance of not being alone. I think our power is like the mathematic idea of the square, that if we're one, do you know the old English song? One is one and all alone, and evermore shall be so. If you're one, it's very difficult to achieve much. If you're two, you have the power of 4. If you're 3, you have the power of 9, etc., etc. So if you want to make these changes, try not to do it on your own. Try to find friends. In conclusion, I would say, we have to avoid the dystopian, Orwellian future described by the Belarusian writer Evgeny Morozov. He talks about digital feudalism. In this version of the future, elites will be able to use artificial intelligence to extend and maintain their wealth and position, and in alliance with authoritarian governments, with the right algorithms, they'll keep tighter and tighter control over the innermost thoughts and behaviors of the rest of us. This is the thinking of Xi Jinping in China, which is driving thousands and thousands of young people onto the streets of Hong Kong. You could almost see our current authoritarian schools preparing kids for this future. I believe another way is possible. If we succeed, we can make creative use of the immense increase in productivity and free time offered by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We can adopt the ideas of circular and sharing economies to create more equitable, humanly fulfilling, environmentally sustainable societies grounded in human rights and democracy. We can use the productivity of artificial intelligence rather than used by it. 30 seconds left. We can focus, we can avoid singularity. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's a bit scary. We can focus on things like empathy, which artificial intelligence can't emulate, not yet anyway. Democratic education can and will help us achieve this, and I think we really have no choice. I have to be an optimist. Despite my age and grey hair, I have 7 grandchildren. We need not just the new Ukrainian school, but the new European school, the new international school, a new kind of school for planet Earth. I would say nothing is more important. Thank you.